Good day. This will be, I hope, my very last program, at least for a while, on the topic of Alexei Navalny. I have previously apologized in the last video I did on this topic about returning to it, and I, to some extent, feel embarrassed about doing that again. However, I do think that we have now reached a point in this affair where it is now possible that we can finally draw a line. What has triggered this particular video are three things. Firstly, the announcement that Mr. Navalny has come off his hunger strike after he was seen by various private doctors in a hospital in the Russian city of Vladimir. The second is the action by the Russian authorities to essentially close down his organization on the basis that it is an extremist organization. That process is still going through the courts, but already there's been a legal decision restricting the organization's activities, and I expect that before very long, a full steps to declare it an extremist organization will take place, and there will be a final decision to that effect, at which point I expect the organization essentially to fold. And the third thing which has triggered this, my decision to make this program, is a brilliant article by the Dutch scholar Glenn Deason on the subject of Russia's liberal opposition, which makes certain extremely insightful observations, both about the position of liberals in Russia and about Navalny himself in particular, and gives Russian liberals certain advice which I can say with absolute confidence and complete certainty they are not going to follow. Having said that, I propose to deal with the first two topics first, before I get to the Glenn Deason article, which I agree with in part, but which I'm going to treat essentially as a point of discussion. Firstly, on the subject of banning Navalny's organization, which would be what calling it or labeling it an extremist organization is ultimately about, I should say that I personally think that is wrong, and I would not do it, because though I think that the organization has indeed engaged in inflammatory language and in various forms of law breaking, and though I also think that Navalny has done the same thing, I also feel that on balance it is better to leave in democracies organizations like this to rattle around, because realistically they're not able to do very much. I am someone who is naturally skeptical about imposing these sort of bans. I think that though they may be justified from time to time, on balance, they are the sort of thing that societies that are either democratic or which aspire eventually to become so should avoid. Having said this, I can fully understand why there are some people in the Russian government who may be taking a different view. From their point of view, Navalny and his organization receive funding from abroad, are quite open in associating and identifying themselves with the interests of various Western governments, which are, frankly, as the Russians would see it, hostile to Russia. And of course, Navalny and his organization engage in serial law breaking. And though they don't say it explicitly, as Glenn Deason correctly said, engage in what is essentially a revolutionary program. Whilst Navalny never openly says that he is seeking the overthrow of the government of Russia through mass street protests, it's very difficult to explain his activities in any other way. And I certainly think that that is what the Russian government thinks he is all about. The fact that he gets so much backing from the West in order to do it probably hardens these views and has brought them to the point where, after the events of the last year, the strange poisoning story, his return to Russia, his attempts to stage a hunger strike whilst in prison and to incite more protests, and the involvement of his organization in all these activities, I can understand, especially given the backing Navalny and his organization are getting from the West, the telephone conversations from Western leaders like President Biden of the United States, President Macron of France, Angela Merkel of Germany. I can well understand why the Russian authorities their patience may have snapped and they may take a different view to mine. So I'm not going to dwell on this much further. I simply register my own skepticism and doubt about this move, my general feeling that it's perhaps, as I said, better to let Navalny and his organization rattle in their box and leave them alone, and my concern that this is perhaps a disproportionate reaction to what has happened, but my acknowledgement that the Russian authorities may have justified reasons in taking a different view. Ultimately, this is their view, their decision. It is not mine. I do not advise them, and I cannot make my view on this sort of question stick. I will say something about Navalny and his activities since he's been in prison. We've been receiving, ever since he went to prison, an unending stream of claims that he is in extremely poor health, that his life is at risk, that he's going on strong hunger strike, and that he insists on being seen by a private doctor. The protests that took place on 21st April 2021 were supposedly intended to support Navalny in his demands to see a private doctor and eventually to secure his release on the basis that his life is threatened. What we now learn is that he did in fact see a succession of private doctors at the hospital in Vladimir, even though they do not appear to have been his own doctors, and as he had previously insisted, that those doctors have concluded that he is not in any serious health risk, and it seems that the hunger strike itself, though real up to a point, was only real up to a point in that he was receiving liquid nutrients through a drip which had been arranged with the Russian authorities. It seems that Navalny almost certainly never intended to take the hunger strike to its ultimate point, and that this was in some way more intended as a symbolic move than an actual one. Well, prisoners who go to prison on political grounds in various countries do sometimes engage in these sort of activities. But what I think has made Navalny's actions in this particular case extremely debatable, as well as put a question mark on the actions of his organization, is that he had apparently made the decision to end his hunger strike before the protests on 21st April 2021 took place. Now, it's important to say that these protests are illegal, were illegal. It is not accurate to say, as the Western media claim, that these protests were actually banned by the Russian authorities. The point is that Navalny's organization did not seek permission from the relevant law enforcement authorities to stage them or agree venues with the law enforcement authorities for where they would be staged. In Russia, as in pretty much every other country that I know, the convention, in fact, the law, always, almost invariably, is that before staging a protest, you have to discuss the protest and the venue and agree the arrangements with the police so that the normal life of the country can continue around you and people are not placed in any form of jeopardy, either in terms of their economic lives or indeed their security. Navalny never does this. He always insists on holding protests whenever and wherever he wants. He refuses to engage the Russian law enforcement authorities with a view to agreeing the sites and venues and timing of his protests, and he sometimes leads those protests into places like Tverskaya, the main highway in Moscow, in the middle of the rush hour, in a way that is calculated to cause the maximum amount of disruption. The protests that took place on the 21st of April followed that same pattern, though they took place in the evening on that working day in order to bring perhaps more people out. The fact remains that they were not agreed in advance with the Russian authorities. I would add that other parties and political groups, including liberal parties and political groups, do discuss with the Russian law enforcement authorities their plans to hold protests, and they generally manage to get permission to stage those protests. So it's not true to say that the protests were banned, but they were illegal. And of course, anybody who attends protests like that in Russia is actually breaking the law. Now, the reason why this matters in this case is that, of course, Navalny and his organization were calling out people to protest in a way which broke the law and which might have brought down upon the people who brought the law in that way potential legal action on the basis that Navalny's life was at risk and that he was on hunger strike and was being denied medical treatment and access to properly trained medical doctors. In fact, when those protests took place, Navalny was no longer on a hunger strike, had already been looked at and checked by the doctors, and it was clear that his life was not at risk. So people were induced to break the law and to potentially put themselves in serious trouble with the authorities on an entirely false pretext. Now, I have to say, the turnout in the protests, as virtually everyone admits, even the Western media admit, was disappointingly small. The Russian authorities claim that only around 14,500 people turned up right across the entirety of Russia. Other people do put it higher, but not by orders of magnitude higher. And it is also the case that the Russian authorities, the police and the courts, seem to have been under strict orders to act with restraint throughout these protests. It is nonetheless disturbing to me that somebody should actually maneuver people or manipulate people into breaking the law in this way by telling them something which is no longer true, that he is on hunger strike, that his life is at risk, and that he's not receiving proper medical attention. I would have thought, given that Navalny is clearly in regular contact with his organization, that the organization ought to have at least informed the people it was calling out of what the true facts were, and perhaps even call the whole protests off. The fact that, on the contrary, the protests went ahead is inevitably going to make many people very cynical in Russia and question whether the entire narrative about the hunger strike, the threat to Navalny's health, the denial of medical attention weren't really pretexts intended to bring people out on protest on the 21st of April 2021, and despite the fact that at the time those protests took place, that narrative had already become out of date and was in fact on that day untrue. That inevitably is going to make people, some of the people who might have turned up to that protest on the 21st of April 2021, more cynical and more wary about doing so in future. In my opinion, this entire episode has caused even more damage to Navalny's reputation and has reinforced the perception which many Russians already have that he is a compulsive attention seeker and someone who engages in posing and grandstanding, and that he is not a truly serious person who should be taken or treated seriously. I think, indeed, that this may be a watershed moment in terms of Navalny's reputation, and that he may not recover from it. Anyway, that's my view. I suspect, as I said, many people in Russia share it, but it's important always to say that Russians have always been far more skeptical about Navalny than Westerners are. But having said all of that, it is the case that there's been a massive amount of publicity in the West about Navalny, and there is constant talk in the West about Russia and about its liberal opposition. And you regularly read in the Western media, in Western newspapers, and here on Western television broadcasts about how Navalny is in fact the true leader of the Russian opposition. Glenn Deason's article challenges that whole theory head on. What he points out is that there may indeed be a constituency within the Russian electorate for liberal ideas and policies, but that the kind of revolutionary politics that Navalny and his organization and other liberals have followed ever since Vladimir Putin became president of Russia is a dead end, that even liberal-minded people in Russia have no taste for that sort of thing and are put off by it, and that the way in which Russian liberal politicians and liberal parties become excessively close to the West and seem to align with the West against their own country reduces their support in Russia even further. Deason is, of course, completely right on all of these points. However, I think that his article, insightful and indeed in some ways brilliant as it is, doesn't really get far enough beneath the surface. My own personal view is that liberalism in Russia has always been, politically speaking, something of a non-starter. Liberal parties have never done well, especially well, in Russian elections. The only time when they actually managed to gain a majority in the Russian parliament was way back in 1906, in the first Duma election. The Tsar called during the period of the 1905 revolution. In fact, the Liberals in that election only did as well as they did because the socialist and revolutionary parties, which might have been expected to do much better at that time, were disorganized and were not able to compete in the election properly. It subsequently became clear that only a small minority of people in Tsarist Russia, actually supported them, supported the Liberals, and that minority was entirely confined to middle class and wealthier people in the two main cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow. What is remarkable is that has not really changed. There were expectations at the time when Mikhail Gorbachev started to open up the Soviet Union and began to call elections, that this would lead to a great breakthrough by the liberal parties and liberal-minded individuals. But in the two elections which took place, to the Soviet Congress of People's Deputies and to the Russian Congress of People's Deputies in 1989 and 1990, which were the hallmarks of Gorbachev's perestroika period and which were relatively open, the number of actual liberals, who were elected was actually extremely small. They did, as I remember, make a lot of noise, but they were massively outnumbered by other people, by other deputies, much more conservative than themselves. And then there was another election in 1994, after Boris Yeltsin used force to dissolve the Russian Congress of People's Deputies, and it was widely expected again that the Liberals at that point would storm into power because supposedly both the Communist Party and the various nationalist parties had been discredited. And I remember the shock after those elections when, instead of that happening, the party that actually won the most votes turned out to be Vladimir Zhirinovsky's a strongly anti-liberal, deeply patriotic nationalist party. And the two liberal parties at that time, Russia's Choice, which was backed by the government, and Yabloko, did far worse than was expected. Moreover, that 1994 election, held in very unusual circumstances, proved the high point of support for liberals in Russia. They have declined in electoral significance in every election in Russia that has taken place since. Quite simply and straightforwardly, Russia is not a favourable or sympathetic territory for liberal parties and liberal politicians. Moreover, it needs to be said also that on the two occasions when liberal politicians and liberal parties in Russia have held power, in 1917 during the period of the provisional government, and during the period in the 1990s when Boris Yeltsin was president and when he was appointing liberal prime ministers, even though he was not a liberal himself, and even though they had little support in the country. On both occasions, the track record of those liberal governments was about as catastrophic as it is possible to get. It is one of the great paradoxes that this fact never seems to be recognized in the West, either the fact that liberals in Russia are few in number and attract little support, even in the best and most favourable conditions, and that their track record is simply calamitous on those rare occasions when they do attract power. But it's also the case that the liberals themselves have never in Russia faced up to those realities. They have never to this day acknowledged, for example, how disastrous the experience of liberal government in Russia in the 1990s actually was, and they have never given Russians any reason for thinking that in the event that they were ever to gain power, things would be any different. Well, why does all this matter? I think it matters because it explains why people like Navalny and other liberal politicians make the kind of serial mistakes that Glenn Deason talks about in his article. The simple fact is that lacking support within Russia itself, and without any real prospect of gaining power through the ballot box, the Liberals have no real option but to do those two things which Glenn Deason says make them unpopular and cause them to lose support in Russia itself. Those two things are to turn to the West for support and to engage in revolutionary or pseudo-revolutionary tactics, the constant attempts to try to stage big protests in Russia, which supposedly will bring down the Russian government. Given that they have little prospect of winning power in any other way, it's perhaps not surprising that that's what they end up doing. But of course, doing that leads them into exactly the same trap that Deason talks about, because most Russians are law-abiding, and even those Russians who are liberal-minded, who are, as I said, not especially many, would be are law-abiding also, and engaging in those sort of activities is going to disincline them from supporting the Liberals even further. What the overall point that I'm trying to make is this. It seems to me that people in the West and indeed Western commentators need to get round to the fact and accept the fact that in Russia, for the foreseeable future, whatever the West does, liberals are going to be a fringe. Maybe one day, as Russian society changes and evolves, that may change. But there is little prospect of that happening in any proximate future. Quite simply, the culture simply does not lend itself to the kind of liberal politics that are in favour in the West. The result is that Russian liberals are doctrinaire and intolerant because they sense themselves to be irrelevant. They remind me in that of the various far-left Trotskyist groups that you used to see in the West and which used to be so common in the 1960s and the 1970s. They make a certain amount of noise, they carry out protests in various places, but they are and will always be a fringe. And liberals in Russia will be that for the moment. They simply do not deserve or merit the enormous amount of interest and attention they get in the West. To talk of people like Navalny, even if Navalny had been a much more serious person than I'm afraid he is, to talk of them as if they were the true opposition in Russia is simply to misunderstand Russian politics, Russian society, and Russian history, and to disregard the facts about these. Perhaps if the liberals in Russia are left alone, if they're not given the relentless attention the Western media gives them, if they do, in fact, have to face the reality that their only route to influence in Russia itself is through the stony ground of involving themselves in Russian politics, and that may very well mean joining political parties which are perhaps in tune with some of their ideas, but not all of them, such as the Social Democratic A Just Russia Party, or even Putin's United Russia Party. Perhaps that will in time create conditions where a more conceivably liberal politics in Russia becomes possible. But in the meantime, giving all this weight and all this influence, or all this attention to these marginal groups is not good for them, and it is not good for the West. All that it does is enrage the Russian government, which sees, quite correctly, that the West is interfering and meddling in Russia's internal affairs and is backing revolutionary groups, or, if you like, perhaps more accurately, pseudo-revolutionary groups in Russia who seek the government's overthrow through mobilizing popular protests, whilst also alienating and antagonizing both from the West and from the liberal figures that the West backs, the mass of the very patriotically minded Russian population. I hope this Navalny affair is going to be a lesson. I doubt that it is. I don't think that there is any conceivable way that Western governments or Western agencies are going to stop this policy of backing liberals. But I do get the sense that there are some people in the United States, especially, who are beginning to wonder whether this massive investment in these groups and in these liberal individuals in Russia, it has been worthwhile. The latest CIA report, internal intelligence community assessment report that was published a few weeks ago in the United States appeared to hint at something of that realization. In the meantime, the Russian authorities are taking the steps that they are. I suspect that the closing down, the effective closure of Navalny's organization is going to be merely the first step. The Russians have already made it clear that they're going to move against all the various Western NGOs and organizations, agencies that work in Russia, which they see as backing the liberals in Russia. And I suspect that they're going to take further action to basically choke off Western support for the liberals in Russia. But in any event, that investment is not worthwhile. It has proved completely counterproductive, both for Western policy and for the Russian liberals, and it is time that it be brought to an end. Thank you for joining me on this program, on this rather arcane subject. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our other channels, our main channel, the Duran, and on Alex Christophorou's channel, my colleague and friend Alex Christophorou's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also support us by coming to our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also support us to the extent that you feel you can via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And please remember that we accept payments and donations in all currencies, including the new electronic ones. Last but not least, don't forget to check out our Discourse server, and also come to our shop, buy the wonderful things you can find there, our amazing magic mugs, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, our hats, and all the rest. And thank you for joining me on this program, and I look forward to you joining me on future programs, and have a wonderful day until then.